Well, hey guys, this is Mrs. Shelton, and I'm going to walk you guys through the immune system PowerPoint today in order to just make sure that you understand it and kind of add a little bit more to it other than just the words that are on the page. So, what we are talking about today is obviously the immune system. It's kind of a cool picture, huh? You got this, you got your body here and fighting off these viruses. And so these are some viruses here. He's kind of doing a little wax on, wax off in order to protect the body from the viruses. Well, it's not that easy though. Viruses are a type of pathogen that aren't even alive that can invade our body. And we have lots and lots of mechanisms in place in order to prevent them from ever getting in. And then once they even get into your body, making sure that we also remember how to fight and combat different pathogens too. So let's go ahead and begin. And our first slide that we're going to be talking about is actually just an overview of what the immune system is. So when we do understand the immune system, we know its function. It is protecting us from pathogens. So pathogens are these bad guys that want to hurt us. They want to eat us. They want to use our cells to help them replicate. They are going to be sucking energy from us. So our body needs to conserve all the energy it has and protect it from tissue and cell damage. So we've got this system that really isn't a full connected system. A lot of times when we think of a body system, we think of like the digestive system and everything is connected, or the skeletal system and everything's connected. But actually, the immune system is a whole bunch of organs and tissues and cells and macromolecules that are produced by a whole bunch of different systems that all work together in order to really protect us from all of these invaders from the outside world that could actually hurt us. So when we actually say in here, the immune system actually includes organs from the integumentary system. So that's your skin. That's kind of one of our primary sources of defense, is to just keep stuff out. But we'll talk about some of the actually molecular level on the integumentary system too. Your cardiovascular system, that's your heart and your veins and your arteries. But it's mainly the blood and that flow of these white blood cells in your cardiovascular system that are going to be working to defend, and then also the production of antibodies as well that are also going to disable pathogens. Now, your lymphatic system is actually a pretty cool highway. So, your lymphatic system, that's that empty set of vessels that are for recollecting lost body fluid. The lymphatic system actually serves as kind of a little fast track, kind of a backdoor mechanism for a lot of white blood cells to travel through your body, and also kind of helps in filtering out some of those pathogens as well. Now, your digestive system, you probably didn't even think that your digestive system is part of your immune system, but it's a huge part. And why do you think you have stomach acid in your stomach? You are eating pathogens all the time. This is why we cook our food, because there's pathogens on our food. And so it hits that stomach acid, and that acid usually kills that pathogen. So it is no longer something that can hurt you. Now, your digestive system also, your large intestine is home to a lot of bacteria. And that bacteria is actually good bacteria that actually helps boost your immune system and actually helps also defend against the unhealthy bacteria that can hurt you. Now, your skeletal system. This might be one of those questions where you go, okay, how do my bones actually protect me from pathogens? But it's your bone marrow that all of your blood cells are produced in. So in your bone marrow has these cells that will turn into red blood cells for carrying oxygen, but all of your lymphocytes. So lymphocytes is a class of cells that we would consider white blood cells. And there's a wide variety of lymphocytes that have different jobs in the immune system, but those are actually all produced in the bone marrow of your skeletal system. Now, your nervous system, well, your nervous system actually has to be responding to some different chemical signals in order to actually help generate increased body heat. One of the responses we actually have is fever to infection. And so it's your nervous system that has to send some of these signals in order to elevate your body temperature as well. Now, last but not least on my list is your respiratory system. It's actually through your respiratory system that a lot of pathogens, especially viruses, enter into. And so in your respiratory system, so that would be in your sinuses and then your pharynx in the back of your throat, and then in your down your trachea and then to your bronchial. Well, those are lined with mucous membranes, and those mucous membranes, even down in your trachea, there's cilia on there too, these little finger-like. You guys know me, I can't not talk about cilia, not do that. But The mucus that's produced there also helps trap any foreign invaders that we might happen to inhale in order to trap them and push them out. Now, also we'll talk a little bit more about mucus too, but there's some chemicals in mucus that also help disable pathogens as well. But that's kind of an overview of your immune system, the parts of your immune system, and just kind of understanding that these all work together in order to protect us. Now, so here's that question that we need to be addressing is what is a pathogen? So when we talk pathogen, we say that word pathogen, we are talking about any disease-causing agent. Now, I chose this particular diagram because I want you guys to understand that when somebody says pathogen, well, actually, let's just use that word germ. When somebody says it's a germ, well, germs are pathogens, kind of everybody's everyday language for pathogen. But pathogens or germs, well, they can be parasites such as tapeworms over here. They can be little protozoa like malaria that gets transferred by mosquitoes. Fungus, actually, when we talk about ringworm or athlete's foot, those are all fungal infections. Actually, prokaryotes, then, when we say prokaryotes, we are talking bacteria, so bacterial infections. And this is, again, with bacteria, a lot of the bacteria can enter in through open wounds and along those lines, or even on the food that we consume, has some unhealthy bacteria that can actually hurt you. Now, most of us right now, when we get a common cold or flu, we are getting infected with a virus. And what a virus is a non-living agent. So non-living agents actually can still harm us. Now, a virus, not being alive, doesn't have a cell membrane, but it has genetic material inside. Now, this particular one happens to be a bacteriophage that infects bacteria. So all living things actually get infected by viruses. But a virus needs a host cell in order to be able to replicate. And so what this virus does is it uses kind of a shell around it in order to then infect and invade a host cell. And then that host cell becomes its source of replicating. And it replicates hundreds of times and then bursts out and then goes and infects other cells too. So viruses are kind of pretty important. Right now, when we are talking about the coronavirus, this is because it's so small. I mean, it's just a small protein that is with genetic material inside. We can't even see it with a microscope. It's so small. And then this one over here that is being hidden behind my face, this is actually just showing you some prions. There's actually some pathogenic proteins. They kind of act like zombie proteins. So my rule of thumb is don't eat brains and you'll be fine. So hopefully you guys can all abide by that particular rule of don't eat brains. Now, when we do talk about the immune system, now there's multiple levels of the immune system, but some common terminology that gets used is we use the term innate defenses and adaptive defenses when we do talk all about the different levels of the immune system. Now, the word innate means that you're born with it. So these are the defenses that, just we're born with this defense in order to be able to ward off pathogens, either the ones that we're preventing from getting inside, or also the ones that do get inside as well. But it also gets referred to as kind of a non-specific defense, that your body's going to have these defenses in order to ward off any type of pathogen. Now, the more complex, and actually, in my opinion, the coolest type of defense is this adaptive defense. Now, adaptive defenses are always at the cellular level using very specific white blood cells that we're going to talk about, your T cells and your B cells, for your adaptive defenses. And this is what it's through this adaptive defense, once your body goes through this, that establishes now immunity to certain pathogens. So when we talk about innate, so we'll talk about our innate immunity, and then we'll talk about our adaptive immunity, and then we'll wrap up. So when we do talk about our innate immunity, a lot of times what you'll see in textbooks is they break innate immunity into the first line of defense and then the second line of defense too. So this one, what we're talking about here is just our basic first line of defense, and it should be logical of what our first line of defense is. Our first line of defense is all about keeping pathogens out. So from this, it's defense. Apparently, this is an image from maybe Europe, or they just really think defense is what wins games. It's kind of my opinion too, is defense. So defense, this first line of defense, these include mechanical barriers like skin, mucous membranes. These mechanical barriers, when we do talk about your skin, and this is why we need to keep our skin healthy. Right now, you're probably using a lot of hand sanitizer and your skin's getting dry. Well, we've got to make sure that we're protecting our skin too, and that first line of defense stays intact. Now, in your tears and also in your saliva, there's some antibacterial enzymes that exist there. The mucus lining, there's also some enzymes that are in there that also help kill off some of the pathogens that are coming in. Your sweat is actually a form of a first line of defense as well. There's some acidity in your sweat. That helps kill some pathogens. Also, your hair oils, there's some antimicrobial proteins in some of those oils that come from your sebaceous glands as well. But these are all ways of trying to just make sure things don't get in. That's kind of first rule of thumb. Don't let the bad guys in. And that's your first line of innate defenses. Now, next thing that happens though is something gets in. Now we've got a second line of defense that actually happens. Now, what actually gets triggered here is a series of chemical reactions that are going to help bring white cells to the infection that's going to occur. So with this, when we do talk about some chemical signals, we'll actually talk, these chemical signals will actually trigger inflammation. You guys have probably heard of histamines. So if you do hear about like a histamine response, that's actually a localized swelling where what we're doing with a histamine reaction, we're increasing this permeability of our blood vessels. And this allows for more plasma to get out, but it also allows these white blood cells to get out too, because we've got these specialized white blood cells that perform what is called phagocytosis. And with phagocytosis, they're basically eating all of these pathogens that are coming in. Now, these big eaters, these are a leukocyte, so a white blood cell, but they're a specialized white blood cell that performs phagocytosis, and we'll refer to them as macrophages, and literally macrophages translates to big eater, is what it is. So this inflammation brings more white blood cells. Inflammation is also going to allow these white blood cells to get out to the surrounding tissue in order to now engulf these pathogens. Now, I do have a challenge question that's down here, and this challenge question, because one of the other things that happens in the second line of defense is fever. Now, fever is not actually caused from the pathogen. Fever is actually caused from your body's response. And so a fever actually does help in fighting pathogens. But my question for you is how? Google it, find out, and then it might be a discussion question that gets posted for you on Schoology in order to be able to answer it. Now, kind of give you a hint, it's actually very analogous as to why we refrigerate our foods. So that's something for you guys to think about. Okay, so here is the cool response. So this is your adaptive defense, or your third line of defense. So you've probably heard, oh, you can't get, you never get the same flu twice. And that's true for the most part if you have a healthy immune response, because your body goes through this adaptive defense, this third line of defense. You actually will form and start forming memory cells. And so these memory cells, then the next time you get exposed to a pathogen, it remembers, it knows how to knock it out immediately, and you never even knew you got infected with it. So let's talk. Let me get this closed off here. Close me out. So now we can actually see this diagram, because this is really a nice flow chart that actually helps us to understand the steps taken when this third line of defense actually kicks in. So first thing that actually happens, so here's my, up here, here's my foreign body. My foreign body, or my pathogen, has to get eaten by a macrophage. Now, this macrophage, so we talked about this big eater, it's just gobbling up everything. But this big eater, when it gobbles it up, it actually recognizes these proteins on the surface of the pathogen and that protein structure and goes, uh-oh, this is not mine. And so when this happens, it actually has the ability to now go directly communicate with a really important white blood cell called a helper T cell. And it actually has this cell-to-cell contact with this helper T cell to say, bad guy in our body, this is its exact identity. And so now that helper T cell has identified this pathogen, well, what's going to happen is this helper T cell, it's kind of like the general of the army, well, or just an overall general, the helper T cell can actually call out through chemical signaling and also through direct contact. So there's some other things that are happening here that we can get to in AP Bio, but this helper T cell can actually notify and initiate cytotoxic T cells and B cells to now go specifically to that particular pathogen in order to wipe them out. Now, cytotoxic T cells, what they do, and then this cyto here, cyto means cell, these T cells are actually toxic to cells that have been infected with that pathogen. So these cytotoxic T cells are going to be engaging in cell-to-cell combat, is what they're actually going to do. They will actually go directly to an infected cell. They release these like nasty enzymes that destroy the cell and kill it right away. But what those cytotoxic T cells do is direct cellular death is what they're going to elicit. Now, the B cell over here, B cells actually attack pathogens a little bit differently. And it's actually pretty awesome what B cells do. Now, B cells, when they get notified of what is my pathogen, what are these special proteins that are on that pathogen that I need to recognize, the B cell actually starts making a substance called antibodies. Now, antibodies, and it's got to be a perfect match. It's got to be an equal and opposite match, too, and we're going to learn this in a second, to these antigens that are on the pathogen. So B cells are going to start making specific antibodies, and once they do, those B cells now start cloning themselves. And when those B cells start cloning themselves because they've learned the recipe of how I'm going to fight off this bad guy, they actually now turn into plasma cells. And those plasma cells now are massively producing millions and millions and millions of antibodies that can disable this specific pathogen. So over here, these are your steps to your adaptive defense. And then this is also your flow chart, help you understand what is going on with those steps. Now, some of the terms I used on the last slide is antigens and antibodies. So when we do talk about an antigen, antigens are on the surface of pathogens, and these are proteins that are on the surface of pathogens. It is these antigens on the surface that our body recognizes as being a foreign entity or ourselves. We have antigens too. So this is also why when somebody gets a transplant, I mean, my cells have different antigens or marker proteins than somebody else's. And so I can't just give my kidney to anybody. It has to have a right match of antigens so their immune system doesn't attack it as a foreign agent. So it's kind of a way for cells to recognize other cells as belonging or not belonging. Now, when we get an antigen in our body that our immune system says does not belong, that's when those B cells start making these antibodies, and they look like these little Y-shaped structures. And they do have a Y shape to them, but these Ys will actually attach to these antigens, these foreign bodies, and disable them. They're kind of like these little chemical handcuffs that flow throughout your blood, and they get released that way. And you can actually see in this diagram here all the different ways that these antibodies can disable the pathogen by directly attaching to its antigen. Now, with that, once this happens, I mean, this is really like the ultimate defense, is once antibodies are being massively produced, that pathogen has no hope to hurt you anymore. Now, when this happens, when our immune system has gone through this adaptive immunity or this specific immunity, what's going to be happening is these T cells and these B cells that fought the war, they actually kind of go into retreat. They don't have as many and they're not as numerous, but they actually turn into long-lasting memory cells. And so now we have memory B cells that remember that exact pathogen. We have memory T cells that remember that exact pathogen is what ends up happening. And this is when we now say that we have acquired immunity. Once our immune system has gone through that whole process of macrophage eating the pathogen, helper T cell being notified, and then cytotoxic T cells and B cells going through the process of directly attacking or making those antibodies, they establish this memory. And these memory cells are going to stay in your body, hopefully for the rest of your life in low numbers. Now, we can also get sometimes passive immunity. So sometimes with passive immunity, so with this, like when you were a baby, you received passive immunity from your mom. Your mom actually was passing on antibodies to you in her milk. And so those antibodies were actually warding off and defending against a host of pathogens. But if you hadn't gone through that process of T cell to cytotoxic helper T cell and cytotoxic T cell and B cells learning how, it was just a temporary immunity. Acquired immunity, you actually have to be exposed to the pathogen and have your immune system go through this process. So here's kind of the cool thing. So again, another thing that I brought up is I brought up this concept that you can never get the same cold twice. Now, when you get exposed to an antigen, so the antigen, remember that antigen is the protein that is on a pathogen. You end up having this immune response. This is referred to as that first time or that primary immune response when your B cells learn to make antibodies. And you can see the antibody concentration. It took a while for it to figure it out, make the right antibodies for that particular pathogen. And now the antibody concentration was high enough. And then we got all better because it killed it and it was done. Now, over here, however, the second time you get exposed to that antigen, essentially what your body is doing is saying, no, I don't think so. This is not going to happen to me again. So what happens is these memory B cells and those memory T cells, they just kick it into absolute high gear. And so what they do is they're just like, nope, second time you get exposed, you're going to have such a bigger response and so many antibodies that are produced in such massive quantities, you actually never even realize you got infected. You do get infected with it, but it's never, that pathogen never is able to multiply enough for where you'd actually feel that you got that exposure. Now, it's actually this response, the fact that we get a primary immune response, and then we have memory cells, and then once we have memory cells, then we get this secondary immune response anytime we get exposed. This is what vaccines do. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. A vaccine allows your body to go through a primary immune response. So now, if you ever do get exposed to something like chickenpox or to measles, well, this is what would happen is a secondary immune response, and you never knew that you got sick. This is why it's important to get a flu shot every single year. That flu shot is helping your body build up memory cells against certain strains of virus that could potentially be coming your way. So here's another slide here about vaccines. So what a vaccine is, and vaccines are way before you ever get exposed. And so with this, it's a weakened form of the disease. And so it has to have those antigens on it. And with that, this actually forces your body to go through that primary immune response. And sometimes we do feel after a vaccine, we feel a little bit of fever, we feel a little fatigue because your immune system is working in order to now make those B cells and T cells to actually fight against this weakened form of the disease. Now, once those B cells and T cells actually learn how to make antibodies against this weakened form, so it's usually dead or it's weakened, it's not anything that's ever going to make you really sick. The feelings you would have would be because of your own immune system's response. But once you have those memory cells, now if you ever do get exposed to that particular pathogen, those memory cells have that secondary immune response and now just massively produce tons of antibodies and you never get sick from it. So vaccines work. Vaccines are awesome. So they're a way for you to build up that immunity, that acquired immunity, without you ever having to get sick the first time. Now, last but not least, that I want to talk about is antibiotics. So antibiotics are something that are only effective against bacteria. And please keep that in mind. When you have a common cold, flu, these are usually caused by viruses because viruses get into our respiratory tract. But when you have something like strep throat, if you have a UTI, these are usually bacterial infections. And so that's when antibiotics are necessary. And antibiotics will kill bacteria. And we actually get antibiotics from, most of the time, we get them from fungus because fungus and bacteria have been battling so often that fungus has developed a lot of these antibiotics naturally in order to kill off bacteria. So overuse can cause resistance, make infections worse. So use antibiotics exactly how your doctor and your pharmacist tell you to use them. And if they tell you you don't need them, trust them. Now, all right, I said last slide was the last slide, but I lied. I just kind of forgot. So I just wanted to make sure we shared with you the viruses that are usually behind our common cold. So just so you kind of hear, these are classes of viruses. So a rhinovirus, an influenza virus, and a coronavirus. So you are probably hearing a lot about coronavirus. And if you're not hearing anything about coronavirus, then you need to have some other news channels that give you some important information. Now, viruses, being again, we describe them, they are protein shells, protein lipid shells with genetic material inside. Well, anytime you are replicating genetic material mutates. So with that, remember that your DNA is information for coding for proteins. So that changes a little bit of the outer coat. And sometimes what ends up happening over time is that some of these antigens now have a different shape and now end up having different behaviors and different recognition. And so viruses evolve and viruses change year by year. And so even though you hear something like SARS was a coronavirus and now you've got COVID-19 that's a coronavirus, well, yes, but they're different variations of those coronaviruses as viruses evolve and change. And they also then change some of their ability to spread and their ability to infect in the host cells and how rapidly they do. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is also why flu shots are important every single year, because those flu shots are actually trying to give you exposure to some of these different strains of influenza, rhinovirus, and coronavirus that might be coming our way that you actually may have exposure to. So trust your healthcare professionals. If you ever have any questions, talk to your pediatrician, talk to your doctor. They're the ones who are best informed about what vaccines are best for you to use based on your health and also based on what your exposure is. So with that, that is the immune system. And hopefully this made a lot of sense to you. And the rest of the videos that are posted will also help you understand your immune system a little bit better. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you back in school sometime soon. Bye.